for coming and what's variously half-term week, recess week, but we still have a really sizable crowd here today, which is a testimony to the influence and importance of our speaker, but maybe also slightly a testimony to what's been going on in Munich and elsewhere, which we're going to get to. It's a delight for me to welcome HR McMaster here to Policy Exchange, where I'm a senior fellow. HR and I are both senior fellows at the Hoover Institution as well, where we're colleagues there, and you're a distinguished visiting fellow also at Arizona State University, and have so many accolades and affiliations I can't possibly go through them all. But you are also the thing that I find most interesting and impressive, a historian, and you did your PhD at Chapel Hill in a book that became Dereliction of Duty, which is one of, I think, 3 or 4 books you've written, most recently also Battlegrounds in 2020, and then your recent book at War with Ourselves. Your career in the military is extremely distinguished, I guess, in 3 different ways, both in terms of active service in both Gulf Wars, in Afghanistan, in many other ways. Secondly, in doctrine development, where you've had senior roles in the US military, and also modernization, acquisition, all these questions that we're looking at now in terms of defense and our own defense review. And then most interestingly, even more recently, you were a US National Security Advisor, the second of President Trump's...
Second of many.
Second of many. America goes through national security advisors faster than Britain goes through prime ministers. So it's in that period of time, and you've written about that period of time. So the audience here is going to have lots of questions. I think a lot on Russia-Ukraine, a lot on the Middle East, a lot on what's happened in Munich. So the way we were going to do today's event is to speak I will speak in conversation with HR for about half the time, for about half an hour. And then open it up to questions. And the hard policy exchange rule is always no question too outrageous, but you have to say your name and organisation. And I'll restate that in a number of times. So think of your questions as we discuss. But HR, I'm going to start with your book, which was my book of the year in the New Statesman, partly because I had not read many books. And
I've just given it to him.
Which is
so give out your book liberally. You'll never know who's going to recommend it.
Exactly that moment. So it's called At War with Ourselves. There are copies at the back of the room. Just tell me a little bit about the book.
Well, John, hey, thanks. What a privilege it is to be with you and to be at Policy Exchange, a place where of impeccable analysis that I've always drawn on across my career for insights into how we should work together among allies to build a better future. And so it's wonderful to be here, and I appreciate you being with me and Dean for the invitation. And so I wanted to write this book for a number of reasons. But in the last paragraph of the book, I talk about how important it is that we have our best young men and women come into service. And I think the person I'm having this discussion with is a great example of someone who served across multiple administrations, across both political parties here with great distinction. It was a privilege to serve alongside you when I was National Security Advisor. And so I wanted to tell a positive story about service. And of course, in the Trump administration, at times it was less than harmonious, my relationship with the president, but really within the cabinet and with my job as National Security Advisor to coordinate and integrate efforts across the departments and agencies to give the president best analysis, best advice, and multiple options, right? So the elected president can decide on the course for his foreign policy and his national security strategy. So I wanted to answer a number of questions for people interested in this, I think, pivotal year from 2017 to 2018. What was it like? What was it like to be National Security Advisor? What the heck does a National Security Advisor do? What was it like to serve in the Trump White House? What were the dynamics that affected the policy outcomes in this period of time? And John, like you, I'm a historian, and I felt a sense of duty to tell the story from my perspective. And I say in the note to readers up front, I've been a big consumer of memoirs like these, and I've always regarded them with a great deal of skepticism and vigilance, and expect that readers do the same. I do think as I look back on the book now and what's happening today, all of the issues that we confronted 2017 to 2018 are all live issues now. And I think if you're concerned about the degree to which personalities and relationships, the president's character, for example, might affect decisions, I think there are clues certainly in the telling of this story.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask you a geeky doctrinal follow-up, which is among the things you were involved in, as well as consequential policy decisions, various contingencies, navigating bureaucratic challenges. You also had the hand on the tiller for the national security strategy, yes, working with Nadia Shadlow and others, which is published in 2017, which sets out a quite distinct, I mean, looking at these national security strategies and having been involved myself, sometimes you think you're being highly original, you go back and you see that sort of 60-70% is said in every single national security strategy, but this was different. Right. So this is a shift in approach, an emphasis on great power competition, an emphasis on economic security. There's a sort of robustness and a recognition of the sharpness of competition and the way it's being carried out in different domains. How do you think that sort of document, A, survived the personalities, vicissitudes of the first Trump administration, and then B, the changing international situation thereafter?
Well, John, thank you. And it raises the question of what good is a national security strategy? Well, I think it is very important for the president to communicate to relevant audiences, obviously his own citizens, those who voted him into office, but also I think international audiences about his foreign policy, and to do so in an unclassified way, and a way that's logical, so you understand really how an administration's decisions and initiatives and programs and operations, if it's a military operation, for example, fit in to what the president wants to achieve for the nation and for allies and partners and for humanity, for that matter. And when I came into the job quite unexpectedly, Katie just reminded me this weekend in 2017. I really felt as if the balance of power had shifted against the United States, and it had shifted against the United States in large measure because we had been sort of operating on assumptions that were fundamentally flawed, and because these assumptions were implicit and not really challenged, we were unable to sort of overturn those. And I think these were really three interlocking assumptions in the post-Cold War period. The first of these was that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that was the assumption that great power rivalry was a relic of the past, and there would be a condominium of nations who would come together and we would work together on global issues through international organizations. And the third, and I think this is a consequence of both the victory in the Cold War and also the lopsided victory over the fourth largest army in the world during Operation Desert Storm in the 1991 Gulf War, that our technological prowess, our military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. Remember some of the phrases in the 90s, right? No pure competitor till 2020, rapid decisive operations, full spectrum dominance, right? And so it was a hubristic view of the world. And then in my view of kind of the sweep of history since that time was that we were set up, that over-optimism set us up for some strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, instead of debating should we have done the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we should talk more about who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy. Financial crisis, 2008, 2009, toss in an opioid epidemic. I mean, there's a series of blows in the United States, which shook our confidence. And I think the emotional impetus behind our policy shifted from over-optimism to pessimism, and a tendency to undervalue the risk and cost of action to undervaluing the risk and cost of inaction and disengagement. So we thought it was really important in 2017 to lay out a foundation for a new approach to foreign policy and national security, and to highlight in particular the need to re-enter arenas of competition that we had vacated based on those flawed assumptions of the 90s and the pessimism and sort of resignation that followed in the 2000s, and to turn on their head these assumptions. And we began really with the competition with the Chinese Communist Party and Russia, and the alliance that we saw really solidifying between them, two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass that weren't stakeholders in the current international system, but were indeed endeavoring to tear down the international rules of the rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules sympathetic to their authoritarian form of governance, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. So the big theme of this national security strategy is a clear-eyed view of the world, not an aspirational view of how we hope the world would evolve, and a recognition that we had to compete to preserve our liberty and our way of life.
So 2 questions as a follow-up. First is, what about the afterlife of that document in the rest of the Trump administration? Were there times when you thought that it helped provide a useful guide, even after you left, on good terms with the president and publicly good terms? And then the second question is, what about that afterlife of that document into the Biden administration? Because some of these themes on competition, on economic security, feed into things like the CHIPS Act, the rapid attempt to deepen alliances, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, things like AUKUS that come after under Biden. So 2 questions.
You know, on the competition with China in particular, there was a great deal of continuity across the Trump administration into the Biden administration, and I think that's going to carry forward to the second Trump administration. And those elements of continuity you've already mentioned. I think if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, the outline of which was declassified by President Trump in January or February of 2020, right before he left office, January of 2020, I think, or maybe during the election year, I can't remember. But it was really an effort on our part to upend the set of assumptions that were relevant to China and replace it with a new set of assumptions, which I think still stand the test of time. And the primary assumption that we upended in really early in March of 2017, soon after I took the job as National Security Advisor. President Trump, you might recall, had his first summit with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago during the first week of April of 2017. And we thought it very important to have in place the foundation for his approach to China before we had this series of bilateral meetings with elements of the Chinese delegation, and the president had his summit. So I brought with me kind of, hashtag predictable for a historian, the previous policies of other administrations toward China, the classified documents, and I read a passage from the Obama administration's policy toward China, the policy of cooperation and engagement. And what was implicit in the passage of that strategy that I read was the assumption that had really prevailed across multiple administrations, at least since the end of the Cold War. And that was that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, and as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. And it was quite clear by 2017, hey, that was not going to happen, And so I just noted, not to be dramatic, as this was a meeting with the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, I noted that we're about to help President Trump put into place the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And assumption 1, as you already alluded to, John, was that for us to compete effectively with China, we must do so with allies and partners across the world. And we put a big emphasis on trying to galvanize our allies to recognize the nature of this competition, whether it's from the sustained campaign of political subversion, sustained campaign of industrial espionage against us, various forms of its mercantilist policies and unfair trade and economic practices, Huawei as an effort, to take over fifth generation communications infrastructure and then exfiltrate data to China so they could weaponize that data against us. We began to try to galvanize an international effort through the Quad, a reinvigoration of that as a format, and the Biden administration picked up that work and I think continued it. And I think the Trump administration, based on the appointees in some of these critical positions, are certainly going to continue that competition in the economic, technological, cyber realm in particular.
Brilliant. So we're going to get to Munich shortly and the kind of mood of the political scene. But let's just try an exercise of shutting down a bit of the noise for a moment and imagine yourself giving advice to the president or the new national security advisor, say, in early January about the national security agenda in 2025.
Okay.
Where would you see the priorities you have on that portfolio?
Right.
The Middle East, which has a Gaza component and Iran component.
Okay.
You have concern about Taiwan on different time frames depending on the different scenarios.
Sure.
you of course have Russia-Ukraine, which is at the forefront of European minds, certainly, but is clearly something the administration's focused. Just shutting aside, moving the politics away for a moment, in pure national security terms, how would you advise, in say just a month ago, the administration to think about it?
So I would craft it with, the president and really into a discussion of dangers and opportunities. And I would just say, hey, for President Trump, he is now confronting, I think, a much more dangerous world than the world that he confronted when he left office, 4 years earlier. And the reason that the world had become much more dangerous, I believe, is because of a coalescing of what I would call an axis of aggressors. These are, again, these two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass and of Russia and China, and their partnership with no limits between Russia and China, but how they've pulled others into this axis, including the theocratic dictatorship in Iran and the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world in North Korea. And they're acting in ways that are simply unprecedented in the way that they're reinforcing each other's efforts and in a joint endeavor, again, to tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules sympathetic to them, and to aid and abet one another's agendas. And with China's agenda, I would just go through what each of them would like to achieve, because the first point I would try to make to President Trump is, hey, these authoritarian regimes have aspirations in mind that go far beyond anything that's in reaction to what we do or choose not to do. I mean, Russia, Vladimir Putin is a man who is obsessed. He's obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness. And he's obsessed with doing it by really essentially reestablishing the Russian Empire. And of course, the tactics that he's using to do that sometimes are overt, like the massive reinvasion of Ukraine. But they're also associated with the shadow war that he's conducting against us, and a sustained campaign of political subversion under the theory that he can drag everybody else down, and Vladimir Putin, recognizing the limitations in his strength, can at least be the last man standing in Europe. China is using Russia, I think, at this stage almost as a proxy war against the West and the existing international order, and is the foundation for enabling this axis of aggressors, feeding Putin's ATM so he can finance the war, providing him with the electronics and hardware he needs to sustain the onslaught against Ukraine. He's playing an essential role on keeping the Iranian theocratic regime on life support by buying 97% of Iran's oil, providing Shahed drones. And Iran is providing Shahed drones to the Russians, and North Korea is providing soldiers to fight in the first major land war in Europe, and millions of artillery shells and missiles, in exchange for help with their nuclear and missile programs. This is a big problem. So I would say this is a much more dangerous world that you're facing. And the reason we're in this danger is because of the perception of weakness. It's the perception of weakness that is provocative. I would say that the Biden administration, essentially, we could talk more about this, essentially green-lighted the invasion of Ukraine, by listing everything they weren't going to do, by pulling our ships out of the Black Sea, by pulling out all of our advisors, evacuating and scuttling our embassy. So I think that it was that weakness that was provocative. That weakness really can be traced back to the disastrous, self-defeat and humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021. Why did October 7th, 2023 happen? I think, again, perception of weakness. It's not a coincidence. It was during this period of time we were having great difficulty in sustaining our support for Ukraine. So if you're Ayatollah Khamenei and you're looking at really divisions within Israel itself with the judicial reform effort and so forth and the protests, maybe a contentious relationship between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, we can't support Ukraine even though we said as long as it takes. And he's like, oh, time to cross this off my list, destroy Israel and kill all the Jews, right? And so I think what I would try to impart to President Trump is it's the perception of weakness that is provocative and appeal to what you often hear him say, right? Peace through strength, and to help him reconcile the dissonance he carries with him with an understanding that you can only achieve peace through strength and sort of an impulse toward retrenchment, under the belief that these complex challenges abroad are somebody else's problem and so forth. So I think that's how I would craft the discussion to describe those dangers. But then I would go to the opportunities. John, I think that Donald Trump could really make us tired of winning. He really could. And the reason is because of the weakness within this axis of aggressors. And if you look at really Russia at this moment, Russia is in a position of profound weakness. I do not believe, I don't care how stoic or tough you think soldiers are, every army, every individual has a breaking point. You can't sustain 30,000 casualties a month. You can't do it. I mean, the Russians can't do it. He's sitting on piles of cash he can't convert. He's spending 47% of his GDP on defense, which is unsustainable. And he's got 30% inflation at the moment, a labor shortage. I mean, a real problem set for him. Look at China's economy now. In China's race to surpass us, they have created real frailties in their economy, big cracks in that economy that are going to widen, based on the real estate crisis, the debt crisis. If you look at the youth unemployment and underemployment issues and so forth, and the economic growth statistics, which China falsifies and essentially doubles. So how much foreign investment is going into China? None. There should be none, by the way, because we should stop underwriting our own demise in China. And in Iran, I mean, the rolling blackouts, the severe financial crisis there as well. So I just think now's the time for us to be collectively tough. And I think to take advantage of our competitive advantages that we have at this moment. Our democracies, we look ugly from the outside, right? I mean, look at the German election. Look what's happening in France, the recent election here in the UK. And, but that's all on display for everybody. But our democracies are actually quite resilient. I believe this axis of aggressors is quite brittle. And I hope that we don't help them up off the mat. I would say to President Trump, don't be like President Obama was with Assad, or with Hezbollah in this flawed pursuit of an Iran nuclear deal, and let the pressure off at this moment. Keep the pressure on.
Okay, I'm going to get into that in some detail in a moment. So a lot of what you said in 2017 transfers to the current context. You talk about threat and opportunities, so you can stick into that bucket great power competition. You can stick into that bucket an even more pronounced example of adversary alignment when the contingencies and challenges come. You can put in that the importance of deterrence and the importance of a peace through strength. I think even peace through strength does appear in the 2017 National Security Strategy.
It's one of the pillars.
But I've also remembered a piece you wrote with Gary Cohen. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal around about May 2017. And the title of that piece is "America First Does Not Mean America Alone."
Right.
How is that edge surveying the current scene and the mood of Munich?
Well, I think it's aged well because it's true, right? If you really think about the competitions that we're facing and the importance of us, protecting the interests of the free world, we have to do it together. Otherwise, you'll see China take a divide and conquer approach, or Russia take a divide and conquer approach. And I describe in the previous book, Battlegrounds, the Chinese strategy of the 3 C's: co-option, coercion, and concealment. Right? Co-opt you with promises of impending liberalization, or co-opt you with the benefits of Chinese investment, or access to the Chinese market and cheap manufacturing there, and so forth. But then once you're in, to coerce you, to turn a blind eye to genocide, or 1.1 million people in concentration camps, or the use of slave labor, or a foreign policy and aggression in which they're bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, or laying claim to the ocean, in the South China Sea, or threatening Taiwan, and then to conceal this as just normal business practices. And with Russia is kind of the 3 Ds, right? Disrupt you with cyber attacks, with political subversion. The second D is deny everything, even what's most brazen, and we play into that. We got to stop playing into that. Remember, look at the Minsk Agreement, 2015. We just cited the foreign forces, that had moved into to eastern Ukraine, and the third D is dependence. Create dependence, dependence on Europe for cheap Russian natural gas. Let's not go back to that, right? And so, President Trump, I think, understood a lot of this, back then, almost instinctively. And we talked to him about it, obviously, and prepared him for his various meetings. But, he would talk to Chancellor Merkel and say, hey, if you love NATO so much, why don't you pay your dues? He's like, why don't you invest in your own defense? And he would say, what is this Nord Stream 2 thing? You're feeding Putin's ATM, and we're defending you? How does that make sense? He was right about that. So I think now if you come forward to today, I was disappointed in the speech in Munich, the vice president's speech in one area in particular, not in the overall message. We're democracies, right? We can be critical of each other. It's one of the things we can do. But when he said, hey, I'm not worried about the external threats of China and Russia, we ought to be worried about them, And so I think that there was an opportunity missed there to highlight, if he does think that there's a squelching of sort of dissent or political discourse or a degree of censorship that he thinks is inappropriate to our democracies. You can make that point because we're friends, we're democracies. But I think he missed an opportunity to highlight the very significant threats from these two, revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass.
Okay, so as we sit here today, there's a hive of activity in Paris, and President Macron has assembled European leaders. There's a group of senior U.S. officials. At last count, I think it's Mike Waltz. It's Secretary of State Rubio. It's Steve Witkoff, who's got an increasing role as the Middle East envoy, but not involved in the Ukraine portfolio apparently. And of course General Kellogg as well, who made remarks at Munich and on a number of issues. There's a series of live debates about who should be involved in those negotiations. It seems that with caveats, there's a recognition that Ukraine absolutely has to be at the table, but there's a view that Europe, whatever Europe is, I think of Henry Kissinger's line about the problem with calling Europe is you're not sure. There's no single line for Europe. Right. But what set aside where you think we should go on the Ukraine portfolio. What's really going on in your reading? Where is there a plan? Is there a direction of travel? Are there a set of instincts? Is something coalescing around a type of approach? How should we read what's going on in terms of the U.S. approach?
Well, it's really hard to read it, and I don't want to pretend like I know what's going on. I really don't know what's going on inside. I think there are a series of impulses, and with President Trump, his impulse is to stop the killing. Like when he says that, he really feels that. But I think what was important for his advisors to do at this moment in particular is to connect what Putin has done in Ukraine, beginning in 2014, and then intensifying in 2022 to the present, is to connect what Russia's doing to the broad campaign that Putin's been waging against the U.S., Europe, the West, since he came into office 25 years ago, right, a quarter century ago, beginning with an attempted assassination of Ukrainian presidential candidate in 2003, right? And then to really show the pattern of the subversion and denial of service attacks against Estonia, the invasion of Georgia. I mean, this the whole drumbeat of aggression, and not confined to Europe, enabling the serial episodes of mass homicide in the Syrian civil war that left 600,000 people dead, and half the Syrian population dead, wounded, or displaced, created the migration crisis so he could further subvert Europe, using that migration crisis to polarize European polities and pit Europeans against each other and create a crisis of confidence there. I mean, look what he's done in the Sahel, for example. So, I mean, just lay it all out against the United States in terms of political subversion and cyber-enabled information warfare. So I would lay all that out, connect Ukraine to that broad range of Russian activity, but then also connect what Russia's doing to the overall agenda of the axis of aggressors and show this interconnectedness. I think that will change the president's perspective and the dynamic. What's going on in Saudi Arabia right now, as far as Europe's perspective, I would not be as concerned about that as what happens next. And I think what would be useful with the discussions in Paris today is to come out of that with really a clear message back to President Trump. Whatever you do not give Putin what he wants up front. And what he wants up front, what do you think number one is? Sanctions relief. Because he's backed into a corner. Keep him backed into the damn corner until he realizes he's losing the war. I cannot think, and John, you're a historian, of one example in military history in which there's been a favorable political outcome that did not reflect the realities on the ground militarily, or the overall dilemmas that you've posed an enemy with. So you're not going to get a positive political settlement unless you have up front a commitment to Ukraine to provide everything that they need to sustain themselves and to maybe even regain some territory, and then also keep the pressure on Russia such that he concludes that he's losing. To get, I think, a positive agreement, it actually requires Putin acknowledging to himself that he's losing the war. And I think there's an opportunity to do that, again, mainly through financial economic means. Again, the president's first message he put out on this on Truth Social, when he talked about driving the price of oil down. I mean, I think that was something important to mention. If you drive the price of oil down to $50 a barrel, even for a short period of time, Putin is really in trouble, And also, if you tighten up the sanctions, crack down on the ghost fleet, I mean, there's a lot more you can do. Apply sanctions to certain banks, Chinese banks, that are facilitating the financial transactions associated with keeping him on life support. So I mean, there's a lot more to do.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we'll take a bunch, 2 or 3 to start off with, and then see how far we can get in the discussion. I see lots of hands shooting up already. I'm going to go to Anne-Marie Trevelyan in the first row. Can we get a microphone round, or is there a mic?
I've got a loud voice.
A loud voice, perfect.
You want to Oh, that's true. Thank you so much for that tour de force. I was in Munich, and I have to say I thought I'd never heard Vance before, but it was interesting to see his both presentation and his focus. He decided, I think, to be the one who wasn't going to talk about bombs and bullets. That was Hegseth's job, and he was going to take the bigger picture. But what worries, I think, a lot of people, and you mentioned it, but the Afghanistan withdrawal was set in motion by Trump through negotiations where the Afghan government was kept out of the room. Now, this is what he appears to be doing again with Ukraine. Now, everyone's screaming blue murder at him, going, please, this is not the way to do it. Zelensky needs to be there too. But Trump has demonstrated with his, and I think genuine, can we stop this killing, please, it's awful, a method which has left a trail of utter destruction in Afghanistan and a population of women entirely locked away and disenfranchised. So knowing what we do about how Russia has behaved with Ukrainians and the most vulnerable already, how do we help Trump to not repeat that method, if possible?
Sorry, it's going to take a couple
Sure,
together.
okay. Right.
Dean, did you have your hand up? You have chairman's prerogative. You can definitely get a question. And you've just reminded me by catching your eye that I should be saying name an organisation.
Oh, First Minister of the Indo-Pacific from the former government.
Oh, great.
Dean.
Dean Godson, Policy Exchange. Thank you, General, for your presentation today. Just be grateful for your thoughts. There's been a lot of attention in this country recently on what's termed by some as the new legal maximalism of the present UK government and its impact on national security affairs. Several obvious manifestations. One, lot of discussion, the ongoing negotiations over the future of the Chagos Islands. Second, over the International Criminal Court's activities, the US administration's new stance, and obviously here, the potential indictments for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. Then there's the question of arms embargoes, the suspension of the export licenses. And there's legacy issues not just in respect of Northern Ireland, not a particular concern, obviously, of the present US administration, but also legacy issues in respect of British brothers in arms and sisters in arms you fought with in Iraq and Afghanistan, notably for special forces. Well, so I'm just interested, in the light of this new legal maximalism, as an eminent servant of the US federal government, the US state, just what your perception of the impact of all that is on our viability as a partner for the US going forward in terms of projects, for example, like the potential risk to the F-35 and other major weapons programs.
There's plenty in there, HR. So why don't you take these two, and then we'll have further round.
On the first question, You raise a very important point, and that's the degree to which, if you don't include Ukraine in these in this negotiation from the very beginning, it delivers a psychological blow, like not including the Afghan government in negotiations with the Taliban delivered a psychological blow to the Afghan government. And Napoleon was right. The moral is to the physical as of 3-1 in war. And I think the way to highlight, to answer your question just to President Trump, is to highlight the psychological dimension of this conflict. And how if we don't include the Ukrainians, they're already having a crisis of confidence in terms of sustained assistance to Ukraine. And then you just give this gift, just give this gift to the Russians, a psychological gift to the Russians who are celebrating right now in Russia. And I would show him that, look what's he follows markets very closely. Look what's happened to the Russian market in the last 24 hours, because they're hopeful that they'll get the kind of sanctions relief that I think would be a disaster, right? So with President Trump, he's reflexively contrary. I write in the book that, if you go to him and say, hey, everybody agrees on this, Mr. President, this is what you should do, or this is what you should say, he'll do the opposite just to spite you, right? So what I used to do, my technique I used to use, and I think this is important to, I'm not saying this to be funny or anything, except I think it actually is a good way for him to think about it, is I would say, this is what Vladimir Putin wants you to say, and this is why he wants you to say it. This is what he wants you to do, and this is why he wants you to do it. And I think laying that out for him, I think, would be extremely important at this moment in particular. And then, Dean, I think the last time I was in this room, I think I was still Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army and in charge of Future Force Development, and you were doing groundbreaking work on what a bad idea it is to give up your sovereignty to faceless international legal institutions, and it turns out that was pretty darn prescient, and I think that really the way to frame this debate is in the terms of sovereignty, and obviously we're in a vibrant democratic nation here. Why would you give up your sovereignty to Mr. Khan on the ICC or anybody? For that matter. And I think with this sort of odious decision that the ICC has made, issuing an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister, I think that ought to reinforce in all of our minds that it's a really bad idea. If you want to kind of hear what Donald Trump would say about this, I would say that his speech in Warsaw, which I think is a really good speech that we should aspire that maybe that's the way he's looking at Europe today as well, the speech he gave in Warsaw in 2017. I would highly recommend it. And the theme there was on sovereignty and recognizing that, that a unified, free, and at peace Europe is in America's interest, but not European countries who give up their sovereignty to international organizations that deny the people, the citizens, a say in how they're governed. On the Chagos Islands, I remember working with Mark Sedwell and the team here in the UK on this in 2017 and 2018, and I was coming to the conclusion that this would be a travesty, put us at a significant strategic disadvantage, especially at a time when China is trying to gain control of critical terrain and choke points around the world, again in this effort to create these new spheres of influence, and I think to prepare to have their way in the Indo-Pacific region. And it constrain our ability to respond to that. I think this is why President Trump has a legitimate concern about both sides of the Panama Canal, for example, being run by a Chinese company which has to act by law as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think in countries like ours that have strong rule of law, overall, it's just a really bad idea to give up your sovereignty to organizations that can be subverted and turned against their purpose. And I see you see this with the Human Rights Council, for example, or the World Health Organization for that matter, and the UN just broadly, and many UN agencies like UNRWA that has been totally infiltrated by Hamas and turned against its very purpose. So hey, I just think we have to recognize that there's no prize for membership in international organizations. These organizations are actually arenas of competition where you have to actively advance your interests, and certainly you ought to be skeptical about giving up any degree of your sovereignty to these organizations.
I'll take another bunch of three. Loads of questions gone up there. Hands gone up there. I'll take. There's two at the back. John Lloyd and Latika. Can I ask you to name an organisation? Keep it short because there's lots of questions.
Hi, Latika Burke from The Nightly Australia. Are you concerned at all that the approach taken by the Trump administration might lose you some allies, partners, least of all the global south, in the way that some of these tactics are being used at the moment? We see bullying, if not coercive tactics on tariffs. We see almost a wolf warrior style diplomacy with J.D. Vance in Munich. Is there a worry that this may be a shortcoming for you when you turn around and ask some of these people to help you counter China?
Yes. Okay, so let me just quickly. Okay, it's a worry because not because of the substance of the policies a lot of times, but because of the statements that are made. And so the question is, how do you make a compelling argument for aligning with the free world, right, rather than aligning with with the Chinese Communist Party and its efforts maybe under the Global Development Program or the Global Security Program, or scariest of all, the Global Civilization Program, right? And I think the way you make that argument is you say, hey, this is not a choice between Beijing and Washington. This is a choice between servitude and sovereignty, right? And so I believe that President Trump, I know the United States is on the side of sovereignty, but when you say, hey, maybe we could just annex the Panama Canal, it's hard then to make that transition into the argument that China is subverting your sovereignty with these predatory loans and subsidies for Chinese companies to take over critical infrastructure. So I think, at times, I write a lot about this in the book, right? President Trump is disruptive, okay? We can all agree on that, I'm sure, right? There's a lot in Washington, maybe in the world, that needs to be disrupted. But what you hope for with President Trump is that he's not so disruptive that he disrupts his own agenda, and becomes the antagonist in his own story. And so I think it's important for President Trump, who's, he's a real estate development guy still, right, at heart. He has a lot more experience now in Washington. He's had 4 years of the presidency. He's very good at political rallies in the United States. I mean, he can really whip up popular sentiment about what needs to be changed in Washington. But oftentimes he's not attuned to how what he says will be received by international audiences. So I think that's what he really needs from his counterparts, right? President Trump does learn. He does listen. I mean, many of you surprised, you don't know, many of you know him, aren't surprised at all. He's actually a very gracious host, right? Whenever he welcomes anybody in, even if somebody he's tweeted or X'd about now or whatever you call it, or put something out on True Social, there's always kind of a cordial atmosphere whenever he's welcoming someone into a meeting. And he does listen and he learns conversationally. So I think, after this meeting in Paris, the phone calls that he has with European leaders, they're going to be important. The visits he has in person are very important. And so I am not in despair, after Munich, like some people are in despair. I'm certainly not going to cry or anything, But I think it's important to engage President Trump, have these conversations with him, and help him understand better how what he says is received abroad, rather than, at a political rally, in Ohio.
Okay, we'll do John and the gentleman beside you.
From the FT. At the end of the Munich conference, President Zelensky put out the idea that it would be a good idea to create a European army. From your long experience, how would you rate the success of bringing together 20-odd militaries with different traditions and so on to be an effective army if there was a reasonably short time scale? Could it be done?
Gentleman beside you.
From Politico, on a similar theme, do you think Britain has the troop capability to be able to put peacekeeping boots on the ground? And on a wider point, there's been talk of Keir Starmer being a sort of bridge between Europe and the Trump administration. Do you think that Donald Trump will be in a mood to approach that bridge, to listen to him in any way?
Okay. Yeah, okay, so on a European army, hey, we have this thing called NATO, man. Let's use NATO, okay? And I think we have this great gift at the moment of having a supremely talented, supreme allied commander Europe in Chris Cavoli, and so the work that's been done within NATO, within now 2 secretaries general, Stoltenberg and Rutte, they know what needs to happen to evolve the alliance in a positive direction and restore a real deterrent capability. There are various dimensions to this. As we know, it's the forces and as the second question from Politico mentioned. I'm sorry, what was your name again? Dan. Was it? Dan. As Dan asked, there's a capacity issue and everything, but there's also an infrastructure issue, and there's also an industrial base issue, right? So we have to all work on this together. I can't imagine any single nation, right, coming up with this solution, and it's really hard based on the degree to which, Europe has disarmed in large measure. Certain countries in Europe for sure, that they would be able to build this back up quickly, without the U.S. as a full participant in the alliance. And by the way, that's good for Americans. And I think what's really important is to show the degree to which us working together in collective security reduces the burden on Americans. Actually, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to have U.S. troops stationed in the UK, Germany, Poland than it is in the United States. That saves American taxpayers money. And by the way, if you look at the combined defense spending of NATO countries minus the United States, it's much larger than defense spending in Russia, at least in the pre-reinvasion period of time. So I think informing our publics, which both of you can do in the FT and in Politico, about those advantages, I think is really important. So I think it's impractical for Europe to do this alone without the United States, or for the United States to do it without Europe, and it would burden all of us to an unnecessary degree when we already have a hell of a lot of work to do. So the question is, can your forces, as part of the alliance or on their own, depending on how you structure your national security strategy, conduct operations in sufficient scale and for ample duration to win against your most consequential and significant threats? That's where deterrence comes from. It doesn't come from symbolic deployments of a platoon here and a company there, and sprinkling forces around. So I think it's important to understand what it takes to fight and win in terms of capacity. What we did for many, many years across all of our militaries, United States included, is we traded off capacity in our armed forces for what we thought were going to be more and more exquisite capabilities that would give us a significant differential advantage over any enemy. And what's happened is our potential enemies have developed countermeasures, right? Electromagnetic warfare, massive drones, counter-satellite, offensive cyber, long-range precision strike. A whole range of capabilities, tiered and layered air defense, that have equalized some of those capabilities, and they've built capacity. Look especially maybe at the size of the PLA, for example. And so we have a capacity issue. Dan, to answer your question, no. None of our armies are big enough, I don't think. I think the U.S. Marine Corps is bigger than the British Army. And we could tell ourselves lies about that. Well, we have this really nifty kit, and more FPV drones or something. But actually, the side often goes to the side with the bigger battalions, And if you look at the way warfare is evolving, what has happened in the near term is there's increasing transparency on the battlefield, right? And what you need are a range of capabilities to blind your enemy, to make sure you can have freedom of movement and action. But then ultimately, because of the countermeasures to long-range precision strike capabilities, you're going to have to conduct close combat. That's why some of the combat in Ukraine looks like World War I. It looks like 1917 with German infiltration tactics on the Russian side, for example. So I think that we have undervalued the degree to which it's important to control and hold terrain. Maybe predictable for an Army officer to say, but wars still finish on land because that's where people live. And so all of our armies, I think, are too small and lack the capacity necessary to demonstrate to our potential enemies they can accomplish their objectives through the use of force. And what's really important, I think, is to say to our publics, hey, it might be expensive. It might take 2.65% of your GDP, instead of 2.5, whatever. Whatever you're debating now in the UK, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And as George Marshall said prior to World War II, he said, hey, when you have the time, you don't have the money. And when you have the money, you don't have the time. And let's try to break that cycle and recognize that if we build our strength, we can prevent a war. We wouldn't be talking about in Ukraine how terrible it would be if it escalated to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon if that war didn't begin with in the first place. So conventional deterrence is still immensely important, even to kind of preventing the unthinkable in terms of an escalation to the use of the most destructive weapons on Earth.
We're short on money and time, so I will. I'm going to ask, and apologies to those online who wanted to ask questions. There's two ladies there with their hands up patiently. I'll take those two questions. I'll take one more from John Gearson, and I'll ask HR to wrap up after that.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Lee, and I'm a student. I was wondering what you make of the Trump administration's choice to delay the ban on TikTok, and whether you think what the implications of that would be for national security.
Great, succinct question.
All right.
Kudos.
Ella Milligan from Bloomberg. Europe's been very clear that it still needs security guarantees for Ukraine from the US. If it's not NATO membership, if it's not US troops, what is it? And knowing Trump as you do you think he'd be willing for the US to provide air cover if Europe puts its troops in? And you just mentioned the debate around 2.5 defence spending in the UK. Can you expand on your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Brilliant. Two good questions. And then last word to John Gearson, King's College London.
Thanks. As John introduced me, colleague of John's. You've referred being historians. I'll give you an historical analogy. 60 years ago, an American president agreed to save Britain's nuclear deterrent, and a few weeks later, one of his senior officials talked down independent deterrence elsewhere, and no one knew what was going on. This is something we understand. With all the events of the last weekend, who should we be listening to? And by which I'm sort of asking, is it clear yet if people are putting out various positions that they really believe in, or they're waiting to hear what the president thinks?
Yeah.
Two good questions. HR, over to you.
Okay, so TikTok, a big mistake to delay it, and to delay the ban on TikTok. And I would appeal to President Trump's, what he used to tell me, my favorite word, General, is reciprocal. Okay, how about some reciprocity, right? I mean, so in the United States, TikTok is crack cocaine, right? This is what the Center for Responsible Technology uses this analogy. And in China, it's spinach, So why is that, do you think? And I think what President Trump has highlighted a couple of times is, well, what are they going to do with your teenagers' data? Well, it's really how they use TikTok for cognitive warfare, right? And to evolve people's thinking about issues. So, I think it's a mistake not to ban it, and I hope it's not because of conflicts of interest but I think what I suspect it is that, like with the ZTE ban, if you go back to that in 2017, and President Trump backed off it, he backed off it because he was hoping to get a really good deal with President Xi that wound up being kind of a disappointing deal in the Phase 1 trade deal. But what the leaders of these authoritarian regimes do with President Trump, and this is it's not a revelation. Everybody tries to influence the person who's often perceived as the most powerful person on earth, is will dangle in front of him the prospect of a really big deal, right? And Putin does this, on whether it's strategic stability or counterterrorism. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could work together, Wouldn't it be great if you weren't permanently hostile to us, man? That'd be great, wouldn't it? So, and then with Xi Jinping, it could be trade or something. You see Iran right now scrambling, right, to try to act like, well, we didn't really ever want to destroy Israel before. Maybe we should come into conversation. It's ridiculous. So they'll hold out the prospect of a deal. So I think I think it was a mistake to delay it. On the first part of your question was what again? U.S. security guarantees. I think there'll be de facto U.S. security guarantees, if not de jure guarantees. If there are NATO troops inside of Ukraine and there's a ceasefire, I think we should go back into the Black Sea, for example, with our ships. I think for Ukraine to be a viable economic entity, they're going to need obviously access to the Black Sea. And if you look at the distance even between the Crimean Peninsula and Odessa, it's quite short. So I could see the U.S. being like outside in kind of security, and And I think that if NATO forces came under duress, an attack on one is an attack on all. And I think the United States could probably destroy every single Russian position outside of Russia in the period of maybe a half day. And I think Russia knows that, yeah, I think it would be de facto. On the UK, I know that there's a defense review going on now, so I would defer to that. I think there's a great bipartisan team working on it. But I would just say, from my perspective, the more the better. And really, again, it's the benchmark ought to be, is your force capable of operating for sufficient scale and ample duration to win as part of alliance against what your most concerning threats are, and that's where you get real deterrence. And finally, it was on the historical analogy was what again? I mean, it was
independent nuclear deterrent, messaging from the U.S.
Okay, so what we should be, I think what you should be concerned or I guess interpret from the recent discussions is there are discussions going on within the administration, right? And I'll tell you, with President Trump, the one thing you get is you get a lot of transparency. It's not consistency, right? But it's a lot of transparency, and he thinks out loud about a lot of things, and he'll say things that are outlandish, you would think, but there's always an issue that he's concerned about that's behind that outlandish statement about Greenland or Panama or Gaza or whatever it is, right? There's something that's not working, and so I think that what you're in looking at it within the administration now is he says, I want to stop the killing, I'm going to stop the war and so forth, but he's going to be confronted with the reality that maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't want to, and he's going to be confronted with I think the reality that to get a viable, sustainable commitment and to avoid the mistakes of the past, like Minsk and the Minsk Agreement in 2015, that he's going to have to take a really tough approach on it. And I think he'll come to that conclusion eventually. I think the person we have on maybe Ukraine's side right now is Vladimir Putin, right? And the people around him. I think that if there is an illusion among some people in the Trump administration that they're going to be able to get a favorable agreement from Vladimir Putin, that Putin will soon disabuse them of that assumption. And so I think that what's critical in the near term is I think for Europe, European allies, to step up as much as you can in your support for Ukraine, to send a clear, unambiguous message to President Trump to not alleviate the pressure on Putin prematurely, to connect what Putin is doing in Ukraine to the broader shadow war and to the broader axis of aggressors, and to help President Trump see the opportunity. Again, don't be like President Obama and get Assad off the mat in 2014. And don't be like President Obama and think you can get a big deal with Iran and alleviate pressure on Iran. Look at what China did with you with holding out the Phase 2 trade deal. Didn't work out. So I think and show the broad pattern of Russian aggression.
It's characteristically brilliant on the history, on the strategic considerations. I think the thing I took away from it that was newer and fresher, which is also in the book, is the human element. And we're in an era of personality, we're in an era of personal contact as well. I think you were brilliantly insightful on that. The phrase I wrote down in my notebook was McMaster class. So thank you for that. Also delivered with such warmth to the UK, to Policy Exchange, to the national security community here, in a way that strikes me you are a man who definitely wasn't at the Munich Security Conference, where everyone had a hangdog expression, and whose football team has won the Super Bowl relatively recently.
That's right, go Eagles.
So it just remains for us to thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, man. Appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. Thanks.